Hello everybody. We have a lot of people on the call, so we will get started, but I'll deal with some housekeeping issues first. Welcome to our Privacy for Life Sciences Processing Health Data for Scientific Research Purposes in the EU and UK. This webinar is part of a series of webinars dealing with privacy issues for life science businesses, any businesses dealing with health data. There's a back catalogue of webinars if you'd like to see them. And the next one that we're doing in the autumn will be on AI and health data. So I'd like to introduce the team. We have Nuria Pasta, a director in the team here in London, and Alex Beresford, an associate, and myself, I'm a partner in the team. We're all privacy specialists, and we have a particular interest in dealing with life science businesses. First of all, there's a lot of information on these slides, but emphasising that you will be getting the slides afterwards, so you don't need to worry about that too much. And we will aim to finish before the hour and to deal with questions where we can. But if you want to if you have a question, stick it in the chat, and we'll either deal with it during this hour or we'll follow up to make sure we deal with it afterwards. So the slide indicates what we're going to cover today. We're going to cover an awful lot, actually. We're going to deal with the crossover of laws here and what we're talking about when we're talking about research with health data, justifying it under data protection laws, and wider across the EU, what the future holds, some complexity and uncertainty we'd like to see covered in the future, and some summary and best practice, some tips to take away at the end. So I'm going to hand over now to Alex, who will deal with the start of the webinar.
Thanks, Sarah, and hi everyone. So one of the most difficult issues when getting to grips with the research-related processing of personal data is that the rules we need to be aware of are actually spread across a variety of sources. So starting with the GDPR, we know that the GDPR is an important source, but we have to look across the full regulation to identify the relevant provisions. Unfortunately, there's no article dealing with everything research related. This is often because the general rules which apply to processing of personal data tend to be softened when it comes to research. Therefore, the relevant provisions are often set out as exemptions to the usual rules in a particular article. Thankfully, the EU and the UK GDPR are currently very similar though, so that's a start. Then, as well as the GDPR, often research-related provisions are set out or supplemented in local data protection legislation. So, for example, in the UK, we have the Data Protection Act 2018, where you'll find a lot of this. But of course, in addition to data protection laws, the areas of health and research are regulated elsewhere. And so we also have to be aware of local sectoral laws which may impact how we approach research. For example, we've helped clients recently with the crossover between data protection considerations and medical device regulations, as well as clinical trial regulations. Now, this can be really tricky, especially where the sources might appear to be conflicting. Finally, completing the picture, we have regulatory guidance, of course. Now, this is really important to understand how the law is to be understood and to really unlock the potential of research. And again, we not only have to consider guidance from data protection regulators like the ICO, but other bodies as well. So, for example, in the UK, we get guidance from the HRA, the Human Research Authority. So hopefully this gives you a bit of a general overview of the ecosystem, key elements of which we're going to be touching on today. So first things first, before we dive into the research provisions, one of the questions which is often overlooked is the question of what exactly we mean by health data. It may to many seem a simple question. For example, the fact somebody has a health condition, that's their personal data. But actually, this is something we regularly work with clients on, really to get to the bottom of it. Health data and also genetic data are listed as special categories of personal data in the GDPR. So this means that ultimately they're afforded greater protection on account of being more sensitive and because use of this data could create significant risks to individual rights and freedoms. Now, health data, according to the GDPR, means personal data related to the physical health, but also note mental health of a natural person. Now, on the slide here, we've listed some details which are provided in the recitals of the GDPR, explaining what would be in scope of the definition. Now, what you'll note is that this is very broad. It includes, for example, the provision of healthcare services, which reveals information about health status. Now, the use of the term revealing means that actually even inferences are in scope. So, for example, say that you sign up to, I don't know, dyslexia services. Even if you sign up to the services with just your name and your email, that is likely to reveal something about your health, and it's therefore captured within the definition. So, one to watch out for. Now, many also often believe they're not processing personal data because identifiers such as name and sample numbers have been removed when you're conducting research. So, of course, if data has been appropriately anonymized, then it's not subject to data protection laws. But more often than not, the data that we are using for research is most useful in some identifiable format. Now, yes, it may have been pseudonymized, and that's a great security measure where you remove the direct identifiers, but it does not mean that it falls out of scope of the research provisions we're discussing today. Now, a quick note on genetic data, because this is actually a distinct category of special category data under the GDPR, but it's also referred to in the recitals which break down health data. So when we're discussing health data today, we are still referring to genetic data as well. Now, just for completeness, genetic data is defined as personal data relating to the inherited or acquired genetic characteristics of a natural person, which give unique information about the physiological or the health of that natural person, and which result in particular from an analysis of a biological sample. Now, I know that's a long definition, so I apologize, but the key takeaway is that it's broad again, and it includes any kind of chromosomal, DNA, RNA analysis, and actually any other type of analysis that enables you to obtain equivalent information. In most cases, you will process genetic information in a research environment to learn something about a specific identified individual and to inform the action you're taking, and this will probably be special category personal data. Now, one other thing I did just want to mention for completeness is something that we've been discussing with clients recently, is that when genetic or genomic data of one individual is processed, it may also reveal health data about others. So, for example, family members. Now, this is a really interesting but complex area. I'm not going to go into it today, but I just wanted to end this slide by saying that this is a really important question in terms of what is health data, and it is key to unlocking the research potential. So that's health data. What we're going to discuss next is what we mean by scientific research. Now, the research provisions we're talking about refer to 3 types of research-related purpose. They're the ones listed on the slide there. So archiving purposes, scientific or historical research purposes, and statistical purposes. Now, to use the research provisions we're talking about, you need to demonstrate that your processing is necessary for one of these purposes. Unfortunately, scientific research is not defined in the GDPR, but the recitals helpfully explain that scientific research purposes, again, viewed broadly, and they could include technological development and demonstration, fundamental research, applied research, privately funded research, including in a commercial setting, so good news. Scientific research purposes include studies carried out in the public interest in the area of public health. Now, helpfully, the ICO has set out some criteria for us for each of the related purposes. Now, these are non-exhaustive, but they do show the types of activity which are indicative of each type of research purpose. So they're really helpful to us. So just picking out some of the examples on the screen here, which I've taken from the ICO guidance, you're looking at things like formulating hypotheses, isolating variables, designing experiments. These all indicate that you're within the scientific research purpose. Now, on the next slide, just for completeness, I also wanted to mention statistical purposes, which was one of those other bullet points, as well as scientific research. Now, processing for statistical purposes refers to activities where the processing's primary aim or purpose is to produce statistical outputs, of course. But to note, you may then use these statistical results for further purposes, including scientific research. And therefore, this criteria is also relevant to when we're discussing scientific research activities. And again, just picking some examples, some of them do overlap with the ones for scientific research, but some of them are additional. So things like sampling populations, designing surveys, interpreting and analysing data, those kind of things. Overall, the key feature is your purpose or your aim of the processing. So keep that in mind. In order to demonstrate that your processing is necessary to meet the purpose or the aim of your type of research, just ask yourself questions like, are you increasing the stock of knowledge? So by knowledge of humankind, knowledge of culture, society, or are you devising new applications of available knowledge? So I hope that's a bit of a helpful overview by what we mean when we're talking about scientific research. I'm now going to hand over to Sarah, I think, assuming that we are processing health data for now and assuming that there are scientific research purposes, she's going to discuss how we might go about justifying this under data protection law.
Thank you, Alex. If you'd like to move on to the next slide, Alex. So we know, as Alex said, probably we're within health data, probably within research. So then how do we justify that under data protection laws? Well, we broadly need to have a lawful basis. I hope that's not news to anybody on the webinar. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that other than to say that's the basic justification for processing personal data overall. But then because we're talking about, as Alex mentioned, special category or sensitive personal data, we're dealing with health, there are additional conditions that you also need to have to justify your processing. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about that in the context of research. So there's a table on this, you can see, it's a fairly simple table. So this is a simple exercise, isn't it? Of course, there's nothing complicated about this, but we have a column on the left, and broadly we pick a lawful basis from the column on the left, and we pick an additional condition from the column on the right. These aren't all of the ones that are available, but these are the ones that are likely or possibly relevant here. So it's a pick and mix. It isn't cross the rows as indicated. The likely lawful basis that's going to apply here is legitimate interests or possibly public task. Legitimate interests is the most common lawful basis overall, and it is likely to be the most popular lawful basis in a research context. This is likely to be the legitimate interest of the business or a third party, that the usual conduct that the business is undertaking. It involves a balancing exercise between the business interests and the rights of an individual. But as well as having this lawful basis and additional condition, there are extra safeguards which change depending on the locality we're talking about. And Nuria is going to go into those in a lot more detail in a short while. But just to mention that you might normally be having to undertake risk assessments when choosing legitimate interest as your lawful basis. But in the research area, because of these additional safeguards that are needed, you're likely to be balancing those rights against the interests in any event. The public task alternative, the common alternative, is when the task might be necessary in the public interest, or if you're a public body effectively and there's a clear basis in law. Public interest isn't necessarily defined, but we're talking here about clear and positive public benefit. So improving health or economic outcomes, provision of more efficient or effective products and services for the public, that sort of thing. So you don't necessarily need to be a public body to invoke this lawful basis, just if there's an element of public interest in what you're doing. So those are the two most common lawful bases. I will just quickly deal with the other ones and then we'll get on to the additional condition. Next one, contract. This is less likely in this area. When we're dealing with contract as a lawful basis, we're dealing directly with the individual. We have a relationship with the individual. So it's possible in certain areas of research, but is less likely to be used in practice. Legal obligation. This could be a common justification for research or part of your research, particularly elements that are dealing with reliability or safety or mandatory reporting. You're likely to be able to invoke legal obligation here. And then we'll come to consent, and you can see there's a health warning there, pun intended, for consent and explicit consent as an additional condition. I'm going to deal with this problem area in more detail in a moment. I will just mention here that it shouldn't be your first go-to lawful basis or additional condition. There's plenty of warnings against that. And consent here, if you are going to use it, needs to be GDPR standard, which is a very high standard. It needs to be high quality, capable of being withdrawn and refreshed regularly. So we pick a lawful basis, as I said, likely to be legitimate interest or public task, possibly legal obligation. And then we also need to have an additional condition to justify what we're doing. So the first one, I mentioned Article 9(2)J. We haven't referred to sections of GDPR generally in this webinar, but I mentioned that one only here because if you're reading in this area about data protection and research, you're likely to come across that reference frequently. So it's to explain that that is the reference to the principal additional condition for research. And you'll see the definition there is set out. As Alex mentioned, it's got three prongs to that, and we're mostly dealing with scientific or historical research or statistical purposes here. To come within this condition, you need to meet the definition of research, as Alex set out and indicated, and then you'd have to meet additional safeguards depending on your area, and Nuria is going to deal with those later. Then there might be other additional conditions that would be relevant here and shouldn't be forgotten. They may be more appropriate than that generic research condition, and I'll touch on them briefly just to explain why that would be the case. So there is an additional condition that says you're processing, but for reasons of substantial public interest. You need to look to local laws for this. In the UK, this is in the Data Protection Act. I think there are something like 23 conditions here. But if you fall within some of these conditions, so for diversity or safeguarding purposes, for example, then this will be a really simple additional condition to invoke to justify your processing. The next one is by reason of personal data that's manifestly been made public by the data subject. Fairly self-explanatory. You need to be sure that there was an intention to make it public, though, if you're using data from public sources for the research. Then we have two fairly big significant ones. First one is in an area of public health, so protecting against serious cross-border threats to health, ensuring high standards of quality and safety of healthcare and of medicinal products or medical devices. So there is an element of public interest again. I mentioned the definition of that, or lack of definition, but likely indication, clear and positive public benefit. And this is likely to be involved where we're talking about public health monitoring, vaccinations, clinical trials, drugs and medical devices, reviewing standards, but could apply where you have a body such as, for example, a group of GP practices trying to improve efficiencies across the group and in other applicable type of situations. So not always where you might think and worth investigating. The last one then to mention is health generally. And this is fairly self-explanatory again, worth considering where we're looking at, for example, provision of health or social care or treatment, or the management of health or social care systems and services. So those broadly the justifications under data protection laws generically at GDPR level that apply across the board. Thank you, Alex. And I'm going to deal with the problems with consent then next. I mentioned it shouldn't be your go-to justification. Multiple regulators across the board have indicated that's the case. There are real problems with it, and there's strong indications that it's probably going to be inappropriate for significant amounts of health research. Why is that? You might think when you are looking at research that consent is compulsory. You might be told that you've got to have consent. Firstly, to clarify, we're not talking about ethical or possibly even legal consent that you've got to get when you're involved in research. So, for example, taking blood from an individual would be an assault otherwise without their consent. We're not talking about that kind of consent. We're talking about data protection consent here. So you might have to obtain ethical consent, legal consent, but not use consent as your justification for data processing. And the reason for that are the real problems with it effectively. Firstly, under data protection laws, consent has to be capable of withdrawal, and clearly that could cause problems for your research. What do you do with data you've already used? What happens with the future? You're likely to have to stop processing and delete but what about data that's already been used? You might well be able to keep intact the current position of the research, but not completely certain. You'd need to look at that. So clearly problematic. Consent, I mentioned there's some specificity needed in consent at GDPR standard. There is some leeway with research. You are allowed to have broader consent to a certain extent, but it still may not be sufficient enough. The whole concept of research isn't necessarily you don't know where you're going to end up, and you don't necessarily know the path you're going to take. That's the whole purpose of it, is to find innovation and new solutions. So if an individual has to be able to understand what is happening with their personal data and how it will be used, to the standard of GDPR consent, that may not be possible in a research concept. So you may be criticised for using consent on that basis. There's also a clear indication here in the health context of imbalances of power. Regulators are clearly indicated in the clinical trial context that that's relevant, but absolutely wider. And you can see if an individual, possibly with a disability or a medical condition, is sitting with medical experts, they may be intimidated, they may not understand, they may not want to ask questions. It's not true consent in the concept of GDPR standards. So real problems, and not your go-to. It shouldn't be the first place you go to. And on the next slide, I'm going to give some indications of examples, areas where I'm often asked for indications of the consequences for this. Alex, if we could go to the next one, thank you. And in these examples, I'll explain why consent is further problematic in some cases. So what I've been talking about so far is primary research. You're wanting to undertake research. Before you start processing, you think about how you're going to justify it and document it under data protection laws. So here are some of the examples beyond that primary research. So what about if we've done primary research and it's become obvious that we need to do some secondary research? How would we justify that under data protection laws? Well, Alex mentioned that under data protection laws, research can be consistent with your primary purpose. You can reuse it for research, possibly without a new legal basis needed. But just for the avoidance of doubt, there's clear indications within guidance. So I've indicated on the slide references with it in a clinical trials context, that even so, even if you did need a lawful basis and additional condition, it would be possible here. And the likely one is the most obvious combination that I've already referred to, the legitimate interest, lawful basis, and the research additional condition. So reassurance here. If you were using consent in this basis for the primary research, then you possibly wouldn't need to reconsent for this secondary research. I mentioned the difficulty of having consent that's specific enough to deal with all your research, and that's even more difficult if you've then gone into secondary research, but it is possible, but complex. So clearly, if you weren't using consent, much more straightforward. Consent may have some extra considerations. So what about where we're reusing personal data? So your primary purpose wasn't research, it was some other use of personal data, so health personal data, and you then want to use it for research. Well, as Alex had indicated, and I mentioned with the first example, it's possible that you can just reuse that personal data for research. The GDPR makes it clear that research is a compatible secondary purpose. It may be that you don't need a legal basis to do this, to justify it, but if you needed to, there would be justifications. As I've mentioned, the likely ones are legitimate interest in the research condition, but there are others. The third example, if you were using consent in this basis, as I mentioned, so if you've got consent for non-research initial purposes, so for something other than research, we're doing something else with the health data, but then we want to use it for research, it's likely that that consent is not going to extend to that secondary research. It's obvious, really. You've asked an individual consent for you to do something with the health data, but it's not likely to have been specific enough to have covered that secondary research that you're thinking about. So although if you haven't been using consent, this would have been straightforward, your justification is likely to be fairly simple. If you'd have been using consent to begin with, then that will cause you problems, possibly needing reconsenting for research later. Then the third example is reusing research personal data. So our primary purpose was research, but then we want to reuse it for other purposes that aren't research. Now, I'm not going to give you a carte blanche here and say this is possible. Context is everything here, but there are indications. There is European guidance, as I've mentioned, some in a clinical trials context, but clearly relevant to indicate that this is possible and with legal basis to justify this. And there is indications within the ICO pseudonymization guidance, for example, that pseudonymized data could be reused for general analysis, so for innovation with products and services. So indications that this is possible. Context is everything. Come and have a word if you're thinking of this and wanting to justify it. So just to mention on the next slide that there are other aspects that we're not going to cover in a lot of detail here. We're talking today about how we justify research under data protection principles. There's obviously other privacy compliance issues involved in health research, and some of these would, justify a whole webinar on their own. But it would be remiss not to mention that you will also need to be understanding your data flows. So you'll need to be understanding what personal data you've got, from who, how it's being used, where it's being shared, and having records of that. There will be transparency issues here. So what privacy information do you need to give and to who? Are we collecting it directly or indirectly? Who should be giving the privacy information? There are risk assessment issues. Who should be undertaking the risk assessments? When do we need to be doing it? What do they need to be dealing with? We will have cross-border issues potentially. What safeguards will be needed? What other regulations, legislation does that need bring into scope? And then we've got other regulations. So you'll have compliance obligations under other regulations, and you'll have to deal with those obligations in a compliant way under data protection laws. I mentioned some of them. We've got quite a lot coming in that would be relevant to you. So AI, can't go an hour without mentioning AI nowadays. We have NIS2 in Europe, NIS in UK, which will be relevant to life science businesses, the Data Act and implications for children, etc. So quite a lot going on. But broadly, that summarises justifying research under data protection laws. And I will now hand over to Alex.
Thanks, Sarah. So you'll remember at the beginning of the webinar, I was talking about the fact that the research provisions are spread across the GDPR and data protection law, generally as exemptions. Now, we can't cover every single provision today, and we're dotting around picking out the key ones, but we thought it would be helpful to take a step back and just quickly give an overview, a general overview of what these provisions / exceptions generally cover. So for ease of understanding, we like to categorize the provisions into three main areas of focus. So the first one is what Sarah's been talking about. It's those conditions for processing special category personal data, and there's also conditions for criminal offence data as well. The next category relates to exceptions with the data protection principles. So Sarah was touching on these ones as well, but things like the storage limitation principle, contrary to the general rule, you can keep personal data indefinitely for research purposes, and research is also identified as a secondary purpose compatible with primary purposes. So it's any exceptions that fall within those sort of data protection principles. And then the third category, which we like to put together, is the exceptions in relation to individual data subject rights. So as I'm sure you'll be aware, the GDPR provides individuals with various data subject rights. However, there are a number of exceptions that can be applied when responding to a request to exercise these rights, where it involves the processing of scientific research purposes. So just one example, there's obviously numerous all over the place, but there is an exception for research built into the right to be informed, where that transparency may, for example, hinder the research efforts. And then I just wanted to mention for completeness that all of these categories, these three categories we've sort of put them into, they're all underpinned by Article 89 of the GDPR, and that requires appropriate safeguards to be put in place as a condition of processing personal data for any of the research purposes. So simply put, yes, there are exceptions, the softening to the rules to reflect the fact that scientific research is so important, but that's not to say that data protection considerations are not also important. And the fact that research often requires a large amount of protected special category personal data means it's really important to have these safeguards in place, and that's what Article 89 is talking about. And so these safeguards, they take the form of technical and organizational measures, and they're things like we've touched on already, potentially pseudonymizing data, for example. So we hope that's helpful in sort of understanding where these exceptions generally fall within the framework. And I'm now going to hand over to Nuria, I think, who's going to talk through some of those extra requirements and supplementary conditions that we find under local data protection law.
Thank you, Alex, and good afternoon, everyone. So as Alex said, I'm going to pick up where Sarah left it in terms of the legal basis for processing. And what we find is that in most European member states, there's local legislation that has introduced additional conditions for the processing of data for scientific research purposes. And what these local laws do, they supplement Article 9.2J that Sarah mentioned before. Again, I'm not going to mention any other article, but it's a useful mental picture to see the additional requirements that will apply on top of Article 9.2J. So the GDPR requires that additional safeguards, as Alex was just saying, are put in place in order to protect personal data used for research purposes. These safeguards, when they become these supplementary measures, must be set out by EU or local law. And what the GDPR says is that the safeguards must be proportionate, suitable to protect fundamental rights, and respect the essence of the right to data protection. The GDPR also sets out that the processing of personal data for research purposes must be necessary for the intended purpose. Furthermore, there is another section of Article 9 which sets out that additional conditions may be set out by local law in relation to the processing of health data for any purpose. So this is the GDPR foreseeing that for the purposes of processing health data for any purpose, there might be some additional local law regulation. So what's the net result here? So what's the picture we're looking at? So the net result is that many, if not most, of the European member states have introduced additional requirements for the processing of personal data for research purposes. So we have worked on projects covering these activities, and we can say that having looked into these in many European countries, what we have, unfortunately, is a fragmented legislative landscape, whereby European countries or EU countries have imposed different conditions in relation to the processing of health data for research purposes. These conditions are sometimes introduced by local data protection laws, and in other cases, they're introduced by sectorial laws, all of which, as I said earlier, supplement the GDPR. So in some instances, the additional conditions are light. So we're looking at countries like the UK, Denmark, or France. But in other cases, there's quite a lot of heavy legislation in certain countries such as Austria or Belgium or Spain or indeed Ireland, which has a lot of additional instructions that apply as supplementary measures to the GDPR. So what this means in practice is that organizations are subject to many of these local regulations, and if they are wishing to roll out regional or global projects, face the challenge of having to navigate and implement these requirements. But it's not all bad news, because we have actually looked into this, as I said earlier, on a number of projects, and we have identified some common themes, which are the ones in the slide. So I'll now go through the different areas in the slide and provide some examples as to local law requirements. So these common themes are relevant in various member states, And as I said, I'll go through them and provide you with some examples. As you will see, some of these are familiar to you. Some of these requirements are already required or covered under the GDPR. But what happens is that under local laws, sometimes the local laws expand them or finesse them. So it is worth still looking at the local law requirements just to make sure what is actually required in that particular case. So first of all, let's look at necessity. As I said, this is already a requirement under the GDPR, but some local laws further require that controllers ensure that the processing of personal data is necessary for the purpose sought. So, for example, in Denmark, there is a requirement that the processing for scientific purposes is of significant importance to society and that it's necessary in order to carry out certain studies. Another example is that in Ireland, for example, the personal data shall be processed as it's necessary to achieve the objective of the health research and shall not be processed in such a way that may cause damage or distress to the data subject. Moving on to security measures. This is another recurrent requirement, which is the implementation of security measures to protect the information. So, for example, local law in the Czech Republic sets out a comprehensive list of measures for controllers to implement, including the imposition of restrictions to access the data. There are similar requirements, for example, and also a list of requirements under Finnish law. So there is detail in the local legislation that we'll need to look at and be aware of. Staying on the security measures element, in terms of anonymization and pseudonymization of the data used for scientific research purposes, this is also a specific requirement in some countries. So, for example, it is a requirement under Belgian law to anonymize or pseudonymize the data set after collection. The law goes on to say that where the data set has been pseudonymized by a controller, the subsequent controller with access to that particular data set should not be given the key by the organization sharing the data with them. Looking at restrictions on dissemination. So this is another additional condition set out by local law. And this has to do with restrictions to the dissemination or use of the data processed. So, for example, under Belgian law, the dissemination of personal data used for research may be subject to consent of the individuals or to other requirements. In terms of restrictions set out by contract, also under Belgian law, the contractual arrangements with third parties may restrict their ability to reproduce the data if it's a special category data, or if such reproduction is likely to harm the security of the data subject. Moving on to records of processing. So regarding keeping records of processing of your research processing activities, this is, as you all know, a general requirement under the GDPR. But this is sometimes developed under local law. So, for example, in the UK, under UK law, the records of processing must contain additional information, such as, for instance, the legal basis for processing. Moving on to a broader topic, which is the topic of governance. In some countries, some of the additional conditions revolve around having a governance framework in place. So, for example, under Irish law, one of the measures that you're required to implement is putting together appropriate governance structures for carrying out health research. Similarly, under UK law, controllers are required to put in place an appropriate security policy. Other measures that we have observed are required is the appointment or the involvement of your data protection officer. So, for example, in Norway, organizations will have to consult with a DPO before processing personal data for scientific purposes, but this required is removed if a DPA has taken place. In terms of health professionals, involving a health practitioner in the processing activities is also a requirement, which applies in more than one member state. And this is because these health professionals are normally subject to professional confidentiality requirements. And an example where this is a requirement is of course, UK law, the Data Protection Act. Looking at a final point, I wanted to look at a more formal requirement, which is obtaining a permit from the local data protection authority or liaising with the local data protection authority by means of a consultation before you carry out the research activities. And this is a requirement, for example, in France or in Austria. So I know this is a lot of information. We wanted to provide you some examples, and as you can see, I mentioned many different local legislations. So it's just to see, for you to have an example of what's out there. So having looked at these additional conditions, my conclusion is that if you wish to carry out scientific research activities and you do not wish to rely on the individual's consent, you'll have to ensure that you meet the GDPR requirements plus these local law additional applicable conditions. So I'll stop here. This is the end of this section, if you like. And we've now looked at what are the current requirements. And for the next section, we are going to do a bit of future gazing and see some legislation that's coming down the line. So can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So first of all, I wanted to discuss what's coming down the line in the EU in terms of new regulations by way of the European health data space, which is a bit of a mouthful, and I'm going to have to say this many times, so bear with me. So before I continue, though, I just wanted to highlight that we only have a draft text of this regulation at the moment. So in May this year, the European Parliament and the Council reached a political agreement on the text, but it might be still subject to change, and we should have a finalized text later this year. What happened also in May is that the European Commission issued a set of FAQs in relation to the European health data space. And these FAQs included this diagram that I've copied in the slide, because I think it's just a really good summary of what this regulation covers. So from the diagram, you can see that the European health data space is trying to achieve 4 different things. In particular, it seeks to empower individuals to have control over their data, to enable health professionals to have access to the relevant health data, to assist policymakers to access the relevant health data, and finally, and most importantly for our session today, to facilitate access to health data for researchers and innovators. So there is an underlying objective to provide greater opportunities for research and innovation. So today we'll focus on the objective, this objective, which is linked to unlocking data for research and innovation, and this is covered under Chapter 4 of the regulation. So before we go to the next slide, I just wanted to highlight as well, who is actually this regulation? Who does it apply to? Is it relevant to you? And what I wanted to highlight is that the regulation is quite complex, and as you can see, it's covering many areas, and it does apply to different actors. For example, it applies to GDPR controllers and processors. It also applies to data holders, which is a defined term within the regulation. But for the purposes of our session, I will focus on the fact that the act or regulation applies to data users, which is a defined term and it's defined as the organization to whom electronic health data is made available via data holders in the EU for secondary use. And one of these secondary uses is the research purpose that we are covering today. So from the definition of data user, you can see that there isn't a requirement that the data users are located in the EU territory. So we will have to wait and see the final text, but it seems that a non-EA based organization may act as a data user under the regulation. But as I say, we'll have to wait and see. Another thing that I wanted to highlight is the definition of health records within the regulation. And it's clear from the definition, which I set out here in the slide as well, that this goes beyond personal data or records which constitute personal data. And what we can see is that, like other legislation which has been recently approved in the EU, for example, the Data Act, the European Health Data Space Regulation is concerned about providing access to health records which contain personal data and also those which do not contain personal data. So it has a broad scope of application. Let's move to the next slide, please. So let's have a closer look. And first of all, we'll have a look at the diagram on the left-hand side of the slide. So starting from the top and moving clockwise, the starting point is a data user wishing to access electronic health data for research purposes. So the European Health Data Space Regulation sets out that data holders shall make certain categories of health data available for secondary processing purposes. These may be personal or non-personal data, as I mentioned earlier, and it might be shared in an anonymized form. So these types of data include many different types of records, and I've provided a few examples here, but these are set out in the regulation, and they are a very long list. So it would be interesting to see. It would be interesting for you to actually check that list. But examples that I'm providing today is, for example, electronic health records, pathogen genomic data, person-generated electronic data, including those generated via medical devices or wellness and digital health applications. These data categories may have been obtained by the data holder for different purposes as well. So going back to what Sarah was saying about, are we talking about secondary purposes of processing? So these might have initially been processed or obtained for a variety of purposes. So for example, the provision of healthcare or for public health, for research activities, or for other policy-making purposes. And these might have been obtained by a broad variety of stakeholders in the public and the private sector. So what will the data user need to do if they wish to have access to this information? So what the data user will have to do is apply for a data permit. This will be issued by the health data access bodies. And who are these bodies? They don't exist yet. Each EU member state will appoint its own health data access body to make such information available. The permit will include restrictions as to the purposes for which the data might be used, including certain purposes defined in the regulation, including scientific research, which is obviously of interest for us today, but other purposes such as the development of products or services, and also the training of AI systems. The health data access bodies will be appointed, as I said, in each member state, and they will manage the application process for the permit. Where the data required contains personal data, the applicant user will have to provide information in the application form regarding the legal basis for processing that it's going to rely on, and an assessment of the ethical aspects of the processing. So going back to the earlier part of our session, the legal basis for processing assessment will have to have been done, documented, and then explained in the context of the application for a permit. In terms of the data permit, it will contain a number of conditions applicable to the data users regarding their ability to use the data, for instance, in relation to the format of the health data access, the purposes for which it might be made available, the duration of the permit, and so on. And in terms of these new bodies, so in addition to granting permits for the secondary use of the data, health data access bodies will monitor the activities of data users and data holders, and they might issue penalties for non-compliance with their obligation. So this is in a nutshell the way in which the application process works. So very briefly, I also wanted to highlight some other interesting issues. So under the European Health Data Space Regulation, it tells out that health data access bodies and data users shall be deemed joint controllers under the GDPR for the processing of the health data in accordance with the permit. There's also the possibility of having cross-border applications by data users who are based in more than one European member state. So there are provisions to facilitate this type of cross-border application. The regulation also sets out that in the context of international access and transfer of personal electronic health data, member states may maintain or introduce further conditions. So this is very much linked to international data transfers under the GDPR. And also, very importantly, there are some prohibited secondary purposes for which the data access cannot be used. And these includes, for example, advertising or marketing towards health professionals, individuals, or corporate entities. So I'll now hand over to Alex, who will tell us about, so we'll do some of the future gazing in relation to the UK.
So just quickly, it would obviously be rude to future gaze on the EU and not look at the UK landscape in a post-Brexit world. Many of you may know that we did have the UK Data Protection and Digital Information Bill, but unfortunately it has now been dropped due to the general election being announced. But do not lose hope, there's lots of other things coming down the pipeline. For example, the Gold Acre Review, the government's Data for Research and Development Programme, the recently formed National Institute of the Health Data Research UK, and the UK Health Data Research Alliance. And these all have broad aims of improving the environment for health data research for the public good. And actually, in fact, just last month, there was a workshop with the government and relevant stakeholders to discuss what the future plans in the UK are going to be. We're really excited to hear the conclusions of this workshop. So watch this space, and obviously we'll keep you up to date if we hear anything. And that's it from me on the UK future gazing.
So I am up next with yet more information about the potential increased complexity and uncertainty because of several factors. So what we wanted to do with this slide, and I'll go through it quickly because I'm conscious of time, we wanted to take a step back and look at some other contextual factors which increase the level of complexity and sometimes uncertainty when you are planning a multi-jurisdictional research project. First of all is the fact that there are other global regimes with sophisticated laws which you may also be subject to, and they do include a level of, bring in a level of complexity. A good example is HIPAA, for example. I was recently looking at into HIPAA for another project, and the concept of the identification, which is actually means something very different under HIPAA and under EU law. The second element of uncertainty is the fact that the regulatory guidance develops very slowly. So, for example, in the slide, I have set out certain pieces of guidance which have been announced but have not been issued yet. So this is in relation to the EDPB guidance on anonymization. So this is long awaited. The previous guidance dates 2012. So we really need an update on this guidance. But also there's the fact that some of the guidance, some ICO guidance, for example, as mentioned here in the slide, are currently in draft, but they haven't been finalized. So even though we do refer back to them, we don't have a final version of it. The third factor which increases the complexity of what we do is the crossovers with other sectorial regulations, even within the same country. So for example, in the UK, there's a process organizations will have to go through in order to apply for regulatory approval for sharing patient personal data for research purposes, and this is known as the Section 251 application. A final point, as a final challenge, is that there might be some fragmented legal landscape in other regulated areas, for example, in terms of clinical trial regulations. So with this additional information of what makes our life complex, but also interesting, and the project's complex, but always keen to take on a challenge, I'll pass on to Sarah.
Thank you, Nuria. So wrapping up now, just next steps conclusions of what we've talked about and some best practice, I suppose. So it's clear there are some challenges for organisations that are wanting to carry out research on a trans-border basis. There's also a lot happening, so watch this space. We will be updating about all of these things, but we have the European Health Data Space, which I think is going to be very interesting in this area. There's updated guidance we've mentioned that's going to be critical and long awaited. There are grey areas we're definitely waiting for clarification. The UK is wanting to change, improve the conditions for research, so that's going to be very interesting to the industry, and there's wider regulation that's going to have an impact here. So best practice, I think in a data protection world, we always start with the data mapping. You can't get to grips with your compliance and justifying your research and making sure that you're not going to be criticised unless you're knowing what personal data is involved. So what's coming in, where is it going, who's it being shared with? That's always the starting point. And then having a compliance plan, really. So we've got registrations with various regulators that we've touched upon. The analysis of your lawful basis, your additional condition, and the local and sectoral requirements, as we've highlighted, is going to be critical here. We've had a question to say, how do you decide which lawful basis, which additional condition applies? And it is a question of going through the definitions, the scope, the requirements, and working out which is best for you, which one has the most appropriate actions to meet with you, and we can help with that if needed, but it's a critical aspect. Transparency is critical. You'll need layers of privacy notices and information. You might have to do risk assessments, so data protection impact assessment and legitimate interest assessment. And then on the next slide, just to finish off, we have records will have to be completed and created. Your processes and policies, clearly contracts here are going to be crucial. Understanding your roles between the parties and the terms needed and who's doing what, who's responsible for some of these things, your safeguards for any international transfers, and dealing with other regulators in a way that's compliant with data protection laws. So finally, on the next slide, just to highlight again that this is part of a series of webinars we're doing for life science organisations. There is a backlog, catalogue if you'd like to see previous versions, and the next one is on AI, health, biometrics, special category data more widely in September. There'll be a webinar and there'll be some workshops with practical discussion in smaller groups. So the last slide just again identifies the three of us with our contact details. If you're interested, do contact us. We've had some questions, but rather than spending any more time, we will follow up with those questions. I think that's probably the best way of doing it. We've dealt with some questions that we have had of general application as we've been going along, but do please contact us if you have any queries. But it's been lovely to speak to you this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.